Hello again. Michael McGovern back with you from WJJQ Studios in Tomahawk, Wisconsin, reading for our seniors in retirement communities, as well as just anyone who's homebound and social distancing during the pandemic. Reading David Maraniss' When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. It's excellent. It's been great so far, even if you're not into football, if you're just catching up now. It just has that old time feel to it. Takes you back to a different era, and he really paints a vivid picture of it. Where we left off for Vince Lombardi was heading into his junior year at Fordham University, playing football. He's had kind of an injury-plagued situation as St. Vince thus far, but hopeful. Also, he just got a girl for the first time, so big deal for Vince here for the last chapter. During his first 3 years at Fordham, Jim Crowley, that's the head coach of Fordham football team, heard no complaints from his Jesuit superiors about the dominance of big-time college football on campus. His problem with Father Aloysius Hogan, the school's president, was of an entirely different sort. Hogan had little use for academics who disliked football. Crowley's problem with his boss was that here was a Jesuit who thought he knew everything about sports. Every Monday during football season, shortly after lunch, Hogan would slip into Sleepy Jim's blue Packard parked outside the campus's Bathgate entrance, puff on his pipe, and launch into a soliloquy on the tactics the coach might employ for the next game. Crowley ignored the advice, but endured the lectures, which were a quiet source of amusement to others in the athletic department, though not to Jack Coffey, who faced the same situation with his baseball team. Once after Coffey's ball club lost a game 18-2, Father Hogan was beside himself, saying there was no reason they should have lost by such a score. Quote, "I help out as much as I can," the father lamented. Quote, "but the exigencies of the job are endless, and I cannot be in two places at one time." His junior year was the most frustrating of Butch Lombardi's career, which is Vince's nickname. He began the season as the regular right guard, but injured his shoulder in a 13-7 victory over visiting Vanderbilt and soon lost his job to Ed Franco. Whether this prompted Marie, his girlfriend, to pay off her bet and give Franco a box of candy is lost in history, but it did cause her boyfriend to sulk. She had bet Franco that he wouldn't be the starting guard, and didn't work out. Franco, in fact, not only played, he became a star. Part of a tough front line that shut out Pitt in a scoreless tie and stifled the offense of talented St. Mary's in a 7-7 tie. The front seven linemen performed so strongly that Fordham's publicist gave them a nickname, the Seven Sampsons. Lombardi was relegated to a backup group of shock troops who spelled the regulars at the start of the game and again in the third quarter. Still, his injury jinx persisted even with limited playing time. He twisted an ankle against Pitt and got elbowed in the mouth so hard in the St. Mary's game that his lower teeth were knocked loose. He wore a bridge for the rest of his life. He was the constant companion of trainer Jake Weber, the diminutive Dutchman known as 80-Minute Jake, who could single-handedly tape the ankles of the entire 40-man squad, 80 ankles in 80 minutes. Harry Lombardi's old admonition to his son, "Hurt is all in your mind," was only partially true. Vinny was hurting body and soul. One Saturday night, stuck alone in his room at St. John's with an injury, he spotted classmate James Ambury walking down the abandoned hallway and called him in for help. Quote, "Would you get me to a priest?" Lombardi asked. Quote, "I need to go to confession, but I can't move." Sleepy Jim's entire team felt frustrated that year. The two ties and a 20-0 thumping by Purdue dropped the Rams from the top national rankings. Thinking that Fordham had no chance against Jock Sutherland's Pitt team, New York's sports writing fraternity had largely ignored what proved to be Fordham's best defensive outing in years, choosing instead to take the overnight train to Columbus to cover the Notre Dame versus Ohio State matchup. But after stopping Pittsburgh, Fordham's players were convinced they were the best squad in the East going into the season finale against rival NYU, which, with an easier schedule, was unbeaten in 7 games and anticipating a bowl berth. Before the game, the New York Evening Journal, Harry Lombardi's favorite paper, though it thought it had a scoop, Fordham's two senior stars, running back Joe Maniaci and tackle Amerino Sarno, reported that two, quote, flashily dressed gamblers driving an expensive car approached them outside the practice field at Fordham and offered them $1,000 each to throw the game. As Maniaci told the story to the newspaper, quote, Sarno and I were on our way to the gym to change our clothes. Two fellows got out of their car. One guy asked, you guys need any money? I said, who doesn't? The fellow asked me if I'd like to make a G for myself and made Sarno the same offer. We laughed. What do you want us to do? The fellow said, we're a couple of bookies, and we stand to make a lot of money on this game if we know which way it's going to go. All we want you guys to do is make sure it's for us. You, Maniaci, you fumble that ball whenever you can, and you, Sarno, make your tackles miss. In other words, dog it. End quotes. Hours before the game the next day, Maniaci and Sarno reported the bribe attempt to Sleepy Jim, the coach, and their teammates. The story enraged the squad, pumping them up even more for the crucial contest, which was played on Thanksgiving Day before a boisterous sellout crowd of 75,000 at Yankee Stadium. Fordham dominated the Violets, winning 21-0, led by the offensive play of halfback Maniaci and quarterback Handy Andy Palau, who caught a touchdown pass, intercepted two passes, punted, returned punts, and won the Maddow Trophy as the game's most valuable player. Lombardi spent the first quarter on the sideline, but rushed the field with a band of teammates in the second quarter when Sarno got into a fistfight with NYU tackle Perry Gaffin. When the brawl ended, Sarno and Gaffin were tossed from the game, and the hole in the line gave Lombardi some unexpected playing time at guard. At midfield after the game, Crowley encountered NYU coach Mal Stevens, whose Rose Bowl hopes had just been crushed. Quote, I'm sorry, Mal, Crowley said. That's all right, Jim, said Stevens. Quote, maybe I can do as much for you someday. Up in the press box, Damon Runyon, covering the game for the New York American, banged out his familiar telegram-style lead, addressing it to the Rose Bowl committee. Quote, Dear gents, sorry we'll be unable to meet you in Rose Bowl. Stop. We used everything possible against Fordham, including our Dukes, but were de-emphasized again. Stop. They have tough chins. Stop. Suggest worthy opponent for you would be Andrew Palau and any 10 other fellows. Stop. Love and kisses. The Violets. End quote. The next day, Father Harold Mulqueen, the prefect at St. John's Hall, where the football players lived, confronted Maniaci and Sarno after being told by police detectives the bribe story appeared questionable. The seniors finally confessed to the priest they had concocted it. Their only motive from the beginning, they said, was to inspire the team, and indeed they had, and the lopsided victory restored Fordham to national renown. The final polls ranked the Rams 11th in the country. There was one final bit of controversy for the Fordham football team that school year, and Lombardi was in the middle of it. It happened during spring practice, as the men were going through drills in preparation for the 1936 season, which would be Lombardi's last. He felt unsure of his standing on the team. Sleepy Jim had been picking on him, making him feel that he could do nothing right. Late one afternoon, after a discouraging session, Lombardi was taking a shower when he was approached by Richard Healy, another senior-to-be who was feeling equally frustrated after 3 years as a second-string end. Healy was known as a practical joker, and this time he went too far. He called Lombardi a wop and told another player to stand next to him to see who was darker. Well, Lombardi was enraged. He tackled Healy to the hard shower floor and punched him several times before Leo Paquin and a few other teammates broke it up. Blood flowed into the shower drain as Healy and Lombardi were taken to the infirmary. Quote, I got an egg on my head, and he got some stitches in his forehead, Lombardi later recalled. Healy said he, quote, got the worst of it in the exchange of blows and carried the shame of what he had done for the rest of his life. Quote, I agonized over it for years. It haunted me. It was another dumb trick, a dumb Irish trick. I regret that. It was a sad moment in my life. End quotes. Fordham had a new president that spring, Father Robert I. Gannon, S.J., who did not think much of big-time college football. When he heard about the shower room fight, he considered it evidence that the violent game was making brutes of young men, turning them away from the responsible traditions of the Jesuits. He suspended both players from the team. Lombardi was stunned. Quote, I thought, he said later, that it was the end of my career. Chapter 3. We do or die. 10 days before the Fordham football squad opened its 1936 season, a young sports writer for the Associated Press visited the practice field at Rose Hill to assess the team's prospects for the coming year. The Cub reporter for the AP later gained journalistic renown as James R. Reston, Washington editor and columnist for the New York Times, but in his early days he covered sports under the informal byline Scotty Reston. Writing in the clipped and matter-of-fact style of the wire service, Reston centered his preseason account on a quote from the coach that was predictable both for its humor and pessimism. Quote, "I feel at home with this squad because they're big, and I can't pronounce their names." This is from Sleepy Joe Crowley. Quote, "But we're playing so many tough teams that we can have a very good year and still lose almost every ball game." The 8-game schedule, Reston pointed out, featured first-rate teams from every corner of the nation. Southern Methodist from the Southwest, St. Mary's from California, Purdue from the Midwest, and Georgia from the South, along with powerhouse Pittsburgh and NYU in the traditional finale. But Crowley had 16 top lettermen returning, and not even his droll pessimism could diminish the great expectations for his team in his fourth year as coach. Reston appraised this as Fordham's, quote, "biggest, fastest, and most promising squad in years." His competitor at the New York Sun, Edwin B. Dooley, in a story headlined, quote, "Ram team may be best in history of institution," wrote his season setter in more effusive praise. Quote, "Everyone on the campus, from the clerks in the office to the gardeners on the lawn, was talking about it. All of them wanted to know if you had heard about the team Jim Crowley is going to have this year. If you hadn't, it was a pity, for it was an absolute fact. You were informed that the Maroon Machine will be the best ever to set foot on Fordham's football fields." The stories noted that the strength of the team would be its 7-man line, led by a rugged junior who played center on offense and backer up, what linebackers were called back then. On defense, he was the player Reston identified as, quote, "the great unpronounceable, 6 foot, 200-pound Alexander Franklin Wojciechowicz." I would spell it for you, but we don't have the time. Who was being promoted for All-American honors as Woj, his more pronounceable nickname. It was said that the sound of his blocks and tackles was so distinctive, a clean and sharp smack, that even a blind man could tell if Woj had made the play. Starting up front with him would be ends Leo Paquin and Johnny Tarzan Drews, tackles Ed Devil Doll Franco and Al Alibaba Babartsky, both of whom had been moved out from guard, leaving left guard for Natty Pierce and right guard for Vin Lombardi. At last, Lombardi was a fixture in the starting lineup, the beneficiary of the persuasive powers and football judgment of Crowley. First, the coach intervened with Father Gannon to lift Lombardi's and Healy's suspensions. Then he and line coach Frank Leahy concluded that they could field the sturdiest forward wall by moving surplus guard talent to tackle, where 2 vacancies had been left by graduation. The new line Crowley built for the 1936 season went from left to right: Paquin, Franco, Pierce, Woj, Lombardi, Babartsky, and Drews. Before the end of 2-platoon football, these 7 were almost 60-minute men playing both ways all season with occasional substitutions, the most frequent being Harry Chakunski at end for the oft-injured Paquin. On offense, they responded fiercely to Crowley's familiar sideline refrain, quote, "blockers, more blockers," he would shout. On defense, they became known as the 7 Blocks of Granite, an evocative epithet that made the 1936 season memorable and blessed the Fordham linemen with a permanent place in football lore. For one among them, the scrappy right guard, already 23 years old, his uneven playing career nearing an early end, it served an even greater purpose. The figurative block of granite became a cornerstone in the construction of the mythology of Vince Lombardi. On the eve of the season opener, Crowley paced the floor of his apartment on East 96th Street in Manhattan. This late-night pacing had become a ritual for him as he turned over in his mind every play that might go wrong the next day. Up at the Fordham campus, 9 of his veteran players gathered in the St. John's Hall room of Dick Healy to tell stories and play craps for dimes on the bed. Butch Lombardi came, the bruises of his shower brawl with Healy forgotten. Paquin, considered the intellect of the group, was interviewing his teammates for a weekly column he wrote for the Fordham Ram. The players were in, quote, "fine physical and mental condition," Paquin determined, and were anxiously awaiting, quote, "the coach's signal to go get 'em, boys." Woj said he was eager for the St. Mary's Gales to, quote, blow into town. Frank Mott, captain and halfback, was expecting trouble from Pittsburgh, which had already started its season and had rung up 53 points in the opener. Franco was nervous about his move to tackle and looking forward to playing the, quote, Southern Methodist gang for thrills. Lombardi said he had, quote, a score to settle with Purdue, which had dealt the Rams their only loss the previous season. Andy Palau, still frustrated by Sleepy Jim's cautious offense, said he expected to pass more this year. The answers were classic ballplayer cliches, none more so than the one Paquin elicited from Johnny Drews, quote, I'm not looking ahead to anyone but Franklin and Marshall, end quote. The opening day opponent, Drews said, noting that assistant coach Hugh DeVore, quote, saw them play last Saturday and reports a great club. Not so great, it turned out. The year before, Franklin and Marshall had surprised Fordham, losing only 14-7. This time, Fordham ran up 66 points before the Diplomats from Pennsylvania finally scored in the closing seconds by falling on a blocked punt in the end zone. The Rams' offense looked unstoppable, gaining 308 yards on the ground, another 98 through the air on 6 of 7 passes. Not exactly the wide-open attack Palau was hoping for, but impressive enough. But the offense created by Crowley, the old horseman, turned from apocalyptic to meek after that first week. Southern Methodist came into New York next, and from the start, all attention was on the visitors from Dallas, who arrived like a traveling circus, replete with mascot pony, marching jazz band, and an official sweetheart named Mary Ann Collins. Riding east by train, the SMU pageant reached Grand Central Station at 10:45 Friday morning. While the players relaxed at the Hotel Croydon, the jazz band and its official sweetheart wowed New York, parading double time down 42nd Street and performing at the Madison Square Garden Rodeo. At the Polo Grounds the next day, Southern Methodists revived the circus atmosphere by keeping the ball high. The Mustangs threw more passes than Fordham might attempt in a full season, 48, and gained 213 yards passing to 0 for the Rams. But for all their showmanship, they could not score. 6 times, Fordham's defenders were pushed deep into their own territory. Each time, they stopped SMU from crossing the goal line. The visitors grew desperate as the afternoon darkened until finally they threw one too many. Johnny Locke intercepted a long SMU pass and raced 75 yards for the game's only score. Fordham had been outplayed all day, but still won 7-0, maintaining its national standing. In the locker room afterwards, Sleepy Jim and his players acknowledged they had been lucky. But Johnny Locke was a shaky hero, nauseous since reaching the end zone. In the excitement of the moment, dashing downfield on his run to glory, he had swallowed a wad of tobacco. Different times. Lombardi was an inveterate talker on the field, always yapping. Aggressive, barking. Come on, let's go. There were times when Andy Palau had to tell him to hold it down so he could call the play. Number 40 was the bossy older brother to his partners along the line, shoving them around even though they were all bigger, demanding more from them even though they were all better. Quote, the better we became, the tougher and meaner Vinny got all the time. He felt it was his obligation to instill religion in the younger players, said Tarzan Drews. The other members of the line were comparatively quiet. Woj, a good-natured quipster out of uniform, turned mum in the locker room before a game and let his hitting speak for him until it was over. Natty Pierce, Drews, and Devil Doll Franco occasionally threw wisecracks and taunts across the line to opposing players, but only Butch was incessantly talking to himself and his teammates. His eyelids blinked furiously. Damn it, what's going on here? When he missed a block or thought a play had been fouled up, he hustled back to the huddle, seething, quote, like a madman, in the words of his line coach, Frank Leahy, who worried that Lombardi was, quote, always treading a thin line between competitiveness and fanaticism. Quote, there never was a more aggressive man who played for me than Vincent. There were times when I genuinely worried he might be too aggressive. He impressed the more talented Woj as a battler, a, quote, fighting guard who never took any guff from anybody. But he rarely let his emotions interfere with his concentration for the next play. As the quarterback in Crowley's Notre Dame box formation, Palau lined up a few yards behind center, then shifted to the left or right before the snap, often ending up behind the right guard. On many plays, he and Lombardi had the same blocking assignment, pulling out to double team an opposing tackle or guard. Vin hitting the defender from the inside, Handy Andy from the outside. They were not the most intimidating sight coming at you. Palau, a bony 165 pounds, 20 less than Lombardi, and both were slow of foot, but they were persistent and smart. They developed their own internal blocking signals. If one thought he could handle the tackler alone, he would yell, "Ice!" and the other would turn upfield looking for a backer up to block instead. Quote, Vinny was very smart that way, according to Palau. Many times he called the play and got it right. His attributes of perfectionism and determination were more apparent to the team than to sports writers in the press box, who dismissed Sleepy Jim's occasional comment that Vinny was his most underrated player. Woj and Devil Doll attracted most of their attention. Lombardi's teammates could not see intimations of greatness of him, but they responded to his forceful character. He seemed mature beyond his years, carrying himself on campus like a young salesman moving briskly on his way to the next call. His shirts and suits were sharply pressed. He toted a snappy brown briefcase with neatly organized class notes and football diagrams. On game days, he helped round up the team for Mass, bringing along even Palau, a Lutheran. After the ritual ankle taping down in Jake Weber's barber chair and a mid-morning lunch of steaks and chops, peas, potatoes, and milk, the Rams marched onto the bus for the ride up Fordham Road and down the Grand Concourse to the Polo Grounds. They sang most of the way, loud and joyous, starting with a playful "She told me she loved me, but oh how she lied," moving on to the sacred, the lilting Latin hymn, Regina Coeli Laetare, and ending with the school's emotional fight song. Lombardi would rise from his seat, flash his luminescent teeth, and conduct the chorus of the Fordham Ram. It does have the words to the Fordham Ram in here. I will spare you my rendition of that particular song. You're welcome. The Southern Methodist show was nothing compared with the coming of St. Mary's 2 weeks later. Led by its ebullient coach, Edward Slip Madigan, the team and an accompaniment of 6 reporters and 253 fans rode out of the Moraga Valley in Northern California on a 15-car special train, stopping to practice at Chicago's Soldier Field along the way. The eastbound party was preceded by Tom Foudy, an advance man born for the carnival circuit, who spread word that the Gales had a new back, Jess Grew, who could throw the ball 80 yards, quote, "and when the wind is right, he can make it to 100, and pass with such accuracy that he knocked a nickel off a stake from 50 yards away." In this, their 6th trip east, Foudy noted the Gales would feature, quote, "the only Jew ever to play for St. Mary's." Sophomore Harry Aronson, the son of a San Francisco tailor, and they would wear sensational new uniforms, solid silk in stockings, shirts, and trousers, all of a shimmering emerald green with red, white, and gold touches. When the train reached Pennsylvania Station, Slip Madigan dashed over to the Waldorf to meet with his pals in the New York Press Corps. Stanley Woodward, the erudite sports editor of the Herald Tribune and president of the New York Football Writers Association, was there, along with Allison Danzig of the New York Times, Bill Coram of the Evening Journal, Joe Williams of the World Telegram, Frank Graham of The Sun, and Grantland Rice and Damon Runyon, among others. In one sentence, Runyon captured the philosophy of his brethren. Quote, "All of us dyed in the wool New York sports writers from Pueblo, Colorado, Memphis, Tennessee, Waterbury, Connecticut, Chicago, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Boston, Mass., and way stations are loyally pulling for the home team today, although it is pretty tough to pull against St. Mary's after you've met Slip Madigan." He wrote for his Both Barrels column, published in the New York American the next morning. Wherever he went in the Waldorf, Runyon said he was accosted by, quote, "inmates of California," wearing little red and blue caps, their, quote, "pockets stuffed full of pamphlets about their home states." Quote, "As a matter of fact, we are commencing to suspect that St. Mary's annual pilgrimage to the big town on the excuse of a football game with Fordham is nothing more nor less than an insidious publicity campaign for California." End quote. The Fordham men were thinking only football. The St. Mary's contest was the first of 3 games in the middle of the schedule that looked as though they would define this promising season. St. Mary's, then Pitt, followed by Purdue. After the first 3 games, the Rams had given up no touchdowns rushing and only 2 overall, both in the final minutes on fluke plays when the first-string line was not in the game. But Crowley was still losing sleep over his offense and starting to take criticism for its lack of firepower. Dooley of the Sun himself, a former running back at Dartmouth, noted that Crowley, quote, has never had an attack at Rose Hill which was even faintly reminiscent of the Four Horsemen, of which Crowley had been a member back when he was a player. Slip was getting all the ink, but Sleepy Jim was certain he had the better story. He was searching, as he often did, for something to inspire his team. Crowley was at heart a showman. Once he invited the heavyweight boxing champion Jack Dempsey to talk before a game. Whenever his friend and fellow horseman, Don Miller, was in New York, Crowley ushered him onto the field for practice, but invariably dispelled the horseman myth with his instinctive sarcasm. Quote, "This is Don Miller, boys," he said once. "He used to play right halfback and block for me at Notre Dame. He is going to take the backs down to one end of the field and give them some tips. I want them to pay very strict attention, and when he is finished, forget everything he said." It's hard not to like Crowley. I'm becoming a big fan. Crowley even tried secret potions. Lombardi later told the story of how Crowley, before one game in 1935, claimed that he had been working with, quote, a scientist from the Swiss Alps, and had invented, quote, a pill that will impart superhuman strength. And this was long before the era of uppers and greenies and steroids. It was a psychological con job. Crowley was using nothing more than sugar pills. The players came forward one by one, tongues out, to receive the wonder pill delivered on tweezers. Lombardi felt, quote, huge, as though he could stomp anybody when he took the field for warm-ups that day. For the St. Mary's game, Crowley tried to inspire his men with stirring words. This was not his strong suit. He could never replicate the mystical oratorical powers of his old mentor, Newt Rockne, from the shadows of the Golden Dome. But in the locker room at the Polo Grounds on that October 24th Saturday, Crowley assembled his men and began a pregame speech that his players long remembered. There was a sellout crowd out there in the stands, he told them, and millions more would be listening to Ted Husing's radio broadcast. Out of the multitudes, he wanted them to think of one special fan, his elderly mother, quote, sitting in her rocking chair out there in Green Bay, saying her beads, end quote, for her boys' good luck, waiting to hear whether Fordham could compete with the best. They must not let her down. Crowley paused, turned to the team manager, and in a low voice that rose to a crescendo, sent his players on a wild charge into the sunlight with the words, "Son, you better open the door and get out of the way fast. Here comes my Fordham team!" End quote. And that's all the time we have. I cannot wait for this game to find out what happens coming up. It's the big game. The latest in the Vince Lombardi biography, again by David Maraniss. Wonderful writer. You can grab When Pride Still Mattered, Life of Vince Lombardi at bookstores, if there are conceivably any open, and you can go out. But you might have to wait until after the social quarantine, distancing, etc. is over, or you could stop by Amazon, but the deliveries are a little bit late in coming, which is why, again, I'm reading. I got it digitally, got it on the Kindle instead of having it delivered because I didn't want to wait. I wanted to visit with you ASAP so we could start out. I wanted to send a shout out to our newsman at WJJQ Radio, Zach Garner. He wrote a nice news story about us doing this, about sharing time with you and trying to be there for folks who are in quarantine now. If you want to take a look at it, it's at WJJQ.com. Click on the news link and scroll down till you wind up finding it. But thank you so much again for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll be back with you tomorrow as well. Be well. Stay safe from WJJQ.